Hey guys, it is Wingy here and welcome to another of my top threes. Now this time, because I haven't done one for a while, I'm going to do my top three worst, and this time we are going to be looking at the 10th Doctor, David Tennant. I mean, I don't actually think I've done a modern Doctor yet, so may as well start with arguably the most popular Doctor, with arguably his worst stories, or at least in my opinion. Now I've got to admit, picking three of the worst for the 10th Doctor was actually quite hard, because thinking about it with hindsight, there's a fair chunk of his era that I don't actually think is that good and really hasn't stood the test of time. As always, these are just my own personal opinions, so if you happen to disagree, then that is 100% fine. So we will kick things off then with a Series 2 episode called The Idiot's Lantern. Now this is one of those episodes that I think the majority of fans would say is one of the 10th Doctor's worst. It's not necessarily a bad story, it's not necessarily one of those like, oh my god, it's one of the worst ever, but for me it's just one of those stories that I never have that desire to rewatch it, and every time I do I'm like, it's okay, but it's never anything special. I think the villain being quite lackluster in this story probably is one of the main reasons why no one really thinks about it that much. In a kind of weird way, it kind of reminds me of like a classic series story, in the sense of the story itself is fine, but the villain's a bit naff. Like the whole hungry thing is just really cringy. I actually quite like the setting with the Queen's coronation and, you know, 1950s England. Or is it London? I'm going to assume it's London. The fact that the 10th Doctor changes his hair to sort of look a bit like Elvis, and there's a few cringy moments where he's like, oh, you're going my way, darling, with the bike, and it's just a few scenes where I'm like, ooh. There's a little bit of a plot convenience as well, where it's like, oh, rubber souls swear by him, where I'm like, okay. Bit convenient. And overall it's just an unremarkable episode of Doctor Who when you consider that the episodes before this were the Cybermen two-parter, which I think is some of the strongest stuff in Series 2, and then after it you've got the Ood two-parter, which again is some of the strongest stuff out of Series 2. This one really pales in comparison, and I just think it's one of those filler episodes that's okay for what it is, but really isn't going to be considered as one of the greatest Doctor Who stories that has ever existed. That's not to say that there isn't some nice moments in this. I really like the Doctor's reaction when he sees that Rose doesn't have a face anymore, and some of the reactions by other characters with the faceless grannies. I actually kind of like the stuff with, is it Tommy? Again, played by Rory from Chelsea Fan TV. Well fucking weird. But I like the stuff with him and his dad, and I do like when the Doctor stands up to him. Apart from that, this is a really unremarkable story with nothing of note in it. I'm going to stick with Series 2, and arguably this entire thing could consist of stories from Series 2, but I'm going to go with Fear Her. One thing I will say about this episode now is it's aged pretty badly. Now obviously it's entirely set in the past because the London Olympics was in 2012, which is of course nearly 10 years ago now. But it's not just that, it's the concepts in this episode I actually quite like, and the fact that it kind of in a way follows the path of The Empty Child, in the sense of they turn a child into a threat. I quite like that, but the problem is the kid in this, Chloe Webber, is really badly acted, and when your main villain, or not necessarily villain, but your main threat as it were, is as lackluster as this, it really takes away from the episode. I quite like the fact of drawings that are taking over kids. I mean, we saw something similar a few years later in Flatline, but that story I feel executed the concept a hell of a lot better, even though the ending to that is a little bit weak. But this one, again, it just feels like filler for the sake of it, because it's after some of the more noteworthy stuff in Series 2, and again, it's right before the finale. It also feels like there isn't really a massive threat there, in terms of, like, there's that whole fear that the dad's gonna break out, but in actual fact nothing actually happens, and in that regard it's actually quite an uneventful episode. I do like the concept again of, like, it's a misunderstood villain and it thought it was doing what it thought was right, which similarly again to The Empty Child, but it takes some of those concepts and just doesn't really do much with them. Again though, like with The Idiot's Lantern, that's not to say that this episode doesn't have its merits, because I think the Doctor is actually pretty good in this story. I really like the moment in the TARDIS where, well, firstly where the TARDIS lands and he's landed in the wrong way, that's quite funny, and also the bit in the TARDIS where he says that he was a dad once. I remember watching that thinking like, oh, okay. Now obviously, having not seen Classic Who at the time of seeing this, or at least not enough of Classic Who, that was such a big line for me, but in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of knowledge that we already know. It's just played to be more dramatic than what it actually is. The supporting cast in this episode I don't think are strong at all. I mean, the council guy is literally just a meme at this point, and whilst he's fun, I'm not going to say an episode is good because it makes me laugh where it probably shouldn't. I mean, when the main monster or the main talking point of an episode is a squiggle monster that attacks people, probably not going to be one of Doctor Who's highlights. This is probably the weakest of Series 2, definitely. I know some people think Love and Monsters, but I actually quite enjoy that for what it is, whereas this one, it's not the worst episode ever, but I wouldn't say it's that far away. In terms of like the modern era, it's definitely up there for me as one of the worst and one of the weakest, because the threat level, like I say, isn't really there. The concepts aren't really executed properly. The acting is a little bit suspect in this in places, and like I said with the Olympic stuff, it's aged pretty badly. So I think the most exciting thing about Fear Her is probably the next time trailer for Army of Ghosts. And then last, but probably by means least, again, I'm not really going to do this in order because I never do, but I'm going to Series 3. Now, some people would expect me to talk about The End of Time, and if this was a top 5, The End of Time would probably be here. But I think The End of Time has some strong concepts in part 1, and then it just falls apart. However, Gridlock for me is a story that I have never really enjoyed. Even upon broadcast, I didn't really like it. The problem with Gridlock for me is a couple of things. One, it's uneventful. It is literally just Doctor Who meets a traffic jam. That would probably be the target novelisation name. Although, is there a target novel of Gridlock? I feel like there might be, but it should be Doctor Who is in a traffic jam. The CGI, again, I shouldn't hold special effects against Doctor Who, but the CGI is pretty terrible. And also, as someone who loves the Macra Terror, there are plenty of stories that you can tell with the Macra, and this story just decides to make them generic crab villains that feed off of emission fumes, which, when you consider that to the Macra Terror, is really kind of lackluster. And listen, I know in 2007 the Macra Terror didn't exist, just like it doesn't exist now, and the majority of people probably wouldn't give a shit about it. But I think with hindsight, it is a bit of a wasted opportunity to just have the Macra as these random giant crabs, when the Macra Terror portrayed them so much better. We return to New Earth again as well, which I feel was a stupid move, to be honest. I understand why they did it to a certain extent because of the whole Doctor and Martha, and she's just sort of jealous of Rose and he's still not over it type thing. That really bogs down this episode for me in places. Again though, there are some nice moments in this story. Like, I do really like the whole premonition with the face of Bo and You Are Not Alone, and the payoff for that in Utopia was incredible. There's the moment where the Doctor's talking to Martha about Gallifrey towards the end, and I think that's actually a really nice moment too. But when you boil it down, the plot of this episode is really, really weak. And whilst there are some nice guest characters in here, Ardal O'Hanlon, of course, from Father Ted and My Hero and stuff like that, he's a nice addition, but like I said, it's just watching people sat in traffic for the majority of it, and the villain is a bit shit. This is never an episode that I'm going to actively want to rewatch. Unless I'm doing a binge watch of Series 3 or just the modern era, I'm probably never going to come back to this one by choice. I will always be like, yeah, we'll go to the next one. Oh wait, that's a Dalek 2-part. Thinking about it, Series 3 is actually pretty fucking weak in most places. Then again, I think Series 2 is. Wasted potential, I think, is the correct words to describe Gridlock for me. I know some people like it. I've seen people talk about it before. I just don't think it's all that. I think it's a pretty weak story that is incredibly forgettable. But those are my choices. In the comments below though, guys, let me know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What would your top 3 worst be, or your bottom 3 worst be? Whatever it is, let me know down below. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure you leave a like on it, subscribe for more. Social media and Patreon links will be in the description, as always. So if you would follow me on any of those things, then I would absolutely love you forever. But until next time, guys, you take care of yourselves. Goodbye.